Yeah, Tim, I know that you are very creative with things. And I was thinking that as you talked about, we have this game Floodplain Manager that ASFPM came out with Foundation. Did it? Do you think is something similar to that, like a flood insurance game or something, is something could be useful? You mentioned that a person knowing, if they do this and, elevate this, the flood insurance would come down or something like that may be a useful thing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I really firmly believe that if people have access to the right information, that they'll make the right decisions. And flood insurance rates and how that impacts it, to me, that people can't do a return on investment calculation very easily these days. They just don't know if they do A, what the result of B is. So any kind of tools that we could provide to make it clearer that, A, they're getting a subsidized rate, B, this is the real rate, whether it's going to be there next year or in 50 years, this is truly where it's going. And then what would it be if they did option A or option B? And I believe when people are given all the information, they have the right information, they will take actions to reduce their risk because it has a return on investment. But a lot of folks, most folks, do not have that information today.
All right. Brian and John, question for actually both of you. And Brian, your presentation didn't include some things that I know you did as leading the Colorado chapter in the post-flood time frame. And I wonder from both of you, as leaders in your local flood or your state floodplain management chapter, what are the one or two lessons learned or pieces of advice you could give the other chapters maybe that haven't taken such an active role after an event that could lead to a more successful recovery? Thank you.
You go ahead.
Well, I would say first and foremost, do whatever New Jersey did. No, I think Colorado really borrowed from the experiences of New Jersey. We borrowed from their steps, and as John pointed out, learning what didn't work for them was critical for us, because the sooner you know which dead ends you can avoid, the faster you can actually implement something. So as a state chapter, I would definitely recommend those of you who are state chapter participants, state chapter leaders, one of the best things you can do is truly market yourself. Get out there and let people know that you're the experts. I know the New Jersey chapter did that pre-Sandy and post-Sandy. And we did not do as good a job of that in Colorado as we could have. So Chad, to your question, I would say the best thing that the state chapters could do before a disaster is to get themselves known. Market to your elected officials, get people to know your name, and for crying out loud, the last and the third most important thing is to make relationships with these people. Because as everyone remember Michael Brown? Yep, you're doing a hell of a job, Brown. He was one of our keynote speakers 3 years ago at the state chapter. And he looked at us and said, I looked at your webpage, it's fantastic. How come you aren't sharing this out? How come you aren't reaching out? And he was the one that made me realize we've been spending so much time reaching into each other in venues like this, talking about the same thing, cheering ourselves on, that we forgot to go out and let everybody else know, except for our clients and some of our stakeholders. So when the disaster showed up in Colorado, we weren't as well known as I would have liked us to be. So we went on a media blitz. We made friends with local officials. We made friends with people who make decisions. We made friends with the people who actually suffered loss. And that's the most important thing, because if you make friends with those people, they realize you truly are there to help, and then you can really help get something done. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, let me give you something that will hopefully make you laugh. We put my cell phone number on our website, and but that was our way of, we had Sandy, and we realized, we're all volunteers, we have a website, but how does someone reach us by phone? So my cell phone number went out there, and that was one of our ways to interact with people that needed a connection, that needed answers, that needed resources. We could do that. So I got calls from adjusters. I got calls often after a newspaper article would come out. People would call us and say, well, how about my situation? And then I would get, in one case, I got a neighbor saying, well, you helped my neighbor out, so, here's my situation. And But it's all about relationship. It's reaching out. And I love that Brian brings up the ideas that, it's not preaching to yourself, it's preaching out. It's going out, making yourself the subject matter expert. You already are, but just reaching out and making sure that others know that. Whether that's the governor's office, whether that's local government, whether that's the media, or there's a host of ways that you got out there. So you use every tool possible to get out there, and especially during this critical time when you have a disaster, there are people looking for answers, they're looking for resources. You need to provide that. You need to be the source. Otherwise, it goes unanswered or people are getting incorrect information. And I always say, if incorrect information gets out there, it's so hard to change that. It's so hard to undo bad information. Take the time to get the good information out there. It's going to be, your cost benefit on that will be very positive, because the time that you spent with the reporter, not just for quotes, not just to give them quotes, but to give them the background information, to really educate them on things, that will pay dividends into the future.
Thank you. Probably comment mostly for Brian. FEMA defines flooding as flood-induced erosion. The NFIP regulations have zones for mudslides, erosion. I'm just curious about your mapping, if those zones were included, or, and for everybody, if there's more of an incentive now, especially locally with that tragic landslide in Oso, if there's going to be more mapping of those particular zones to broaden the definition and hazard mapping of floods to include those aspects of erosion and mudslides.
I would love to see that. I know the conversation has started in our state chapter, but again, since we're trying to catch up post-disaster, we're trying to create relationships on the fly. I know Jamie Prochnow, our state NFIP coordinator, who's also in the room today, she is working hard through her committee in the state chapter to try and bring some of what's been learned in other states to Colorado. So for example, when Hurricane Irene hit hard the East Coast, Vermont learned the same lessons that we're learning now. They're just a couple years, 3 years ahead of us. So we're trying to borrow from the lessons that they learned and some of the ideas that they put in place. And we're also borrowing from other states, places like Austin, Texas. We're trying to collect as much information as we can to say, hey, there's good ideas out there. We don't have to start from scratch, but we can map these hazards like you're saying. We can map erosion hazards. We can understand channel migration better than we did 20 years ago. And the fact that we have all this technology to help us show it on maps that have eye candy and pretty pictures that the media likes and that the people look at, I think we need to take full advantage of that. So are we doing that? Not yet. Are we trying? You bet. And I would love to see all those hazards show up on some map somewhere in Colorado.
Okay, we have time for one or two more very quick questions. It's hard for me to see, so if you have a question. Yes.
Good morning, Maggie Skandarian from Portland, Oregon. I had a question for Tim. We're in the midst of visioning a very ambitious project to potentially take about close to 400 folks out of the 100-year floodplain. I won't go into the details, but one of the interesting challenges is that there's a number of multifamily rental properties in this area. And we have a fairly robust buyout program in Portland as well for a specific watershed, Johnson Creek, where I focus my efforts. And we found that doing buyouts with rental properties can be extremely expensive because of the guidelines around relocation. And I'm just wondering, I think you said there were 200 units in that. And I'm just wondering how you manage that, or if it's just, you just have to bite the bullet and that's part of doing business, or if there was something particular you were able to do to address that or be able to deal with it.
Yeah, no, that's one of the costs of doing business. Yeah, it was over 200, I think 280 units, and you know, paying for relocation benefits, you know, is expensive. When we don't use federal funding, when we use federal funding, we follow the Uniform Relocation Act. When we don't use federal funding, we don't do nearly as much. We make sure that folks can move and afford to move, but we don't pay all sorts of differentials and things because it's our local money and that's just a choice that we make. So it just depends on the pot of money as well. But it's a challenge. Drives the cost up significantly.